Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today at this discussion on Restart, the Last Chance for the Indian Economy, authored by Mr. Mihir Sharma, Opinion Editor at the Business Standard. We have the honor of having with us Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament Lok Sabha and Trustee of the Ananta Aspen Centre. And the discussion would be chaired by Mr. T.N. Ninan, Chairman of the Business Standard Limited and Chairman of the Ananta Aspen Centre. Before we begin the session, I would request you all to please turn your phones on silent. Copies of the book are available outside on sale. I now hand over the stage to Mr. Ninan. Mr. Ninan, please.
Thank you, Samat, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session to discuss Mihir's last chance for the Indian economy. We have Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who will have to leave at 5:40 because he has to be somewhere else before 6. So I think that gives us about an hour, and if folks are interested, we could continue for a little beyond, or we'll wind up at 5:40. And the structure of the session is that I'd like to say a few brief words by way of introduction, and then Shashi will come in with comments of his own. We will then give Mihir a chance to explain what's between his covers, and then we'll finally throw it open for discussion, questions, whatever comes along. Mihir's a colleague at Business Standard, and it's stimulating to have him around. He's, I think, fundamentally subversive. He basically wants to go at anybody who is important, and more important, self-important. And then he really looks for the weak spot and then sticks in a knife and then skewers you. And he does it very well. He combines it with wit and humor in a very effective combination. And so I find we sometimes share the page in the paper, or sometimes we're not facing pages. And so then we're on the websites together. I think I'm a sort of halfway decent columnist, but when the numbers are reported every day on how many people read what on the website, I must say that Mihir beats me by a mile every time. So I'm waiting for the chance to sack him, because you don't beat your boss at golf. But it's very good to have him with us. Mihir was 12 years old, or 13 years old maybe, when the economic reforms program began. And frankly, if we have to read a book of the kind that he's written 24 years later, to me, it's a sign of failure. Because this is a cry from the heart. It looks at all manner of failures in manufacturing, in providing for infrastructure, in providing jobs, all the frustrations of a young observer looking at things around. And he uses statistics intelligently. He makes points very crisply, very quickly. So it's a great read, it's an easy read, and they're in large, short little things that you can take in easy bites on a metro ride, or you don't even need a plane ride, actually. So I thoroughly enjoyed both his wit and the sharp points that he made, and how well he makes them. And just to close, I'd like to give you a flavor, for those who have not read the book, a little bit of how he makes a point with detail, without really having to make much of a comment himself, except that he throws in some little acid wisecracks along the way. And this is how he describes the Factories Act. Under Rule 3, your application for permission to construct, extend, or take into use any building as a factory. Under Rules 4 and 12, your application for registration and grant of amendment of license. Under Rule 3, subsection 4, your certificate of stability, whatever that means. Under Rule 5, your license to work as a factory, which is quite different from your registration of a license. Under Rule 10, etc., etc., It goes on into all the rules concerning work, examination of vessels kept under pressure, register of compensatory holidays, child workers under rules 14 and 115, some leave book, which is different from a register of leave. And then there's a health register, and then there's a dangerous occurrences, and then there's an attendance card, and separately from that, a muster roll, and some lime register, and there will be no spots on your walls. And it just goes on. He lists all the rules and sub-rules all the way through 2.5 or 3 pages. And you ask yourself, what does an inspector who has to certify all this for every factory in the country end up doing? And Mihir, of course, tells you what happens. So it's a kind of thing that we all know about. But if you want to make the point, you have to make it with detail. And I didn't give you the wisecracks he had along the way. That's for you to enjoy when you actually read the book. But just with that little introduction, I'd like to invite Shashi to please come in.
Well, I'll echo really what Ninan has just said, except that Mihir is not a colleague. There is absolutely no mutual back scratching going on, because the only time he ever wrote a piece about me, he did the skewering that Ninan has already mentioned he specializes in. It was not a nice piece to read. But having said that, I must say that I enjoyed this book immensely. Actually, I launched it with him at the Jaipur Literary Festival in January. So some of the which has not stayed in my brain, or I would have quoted it to you more frequently. But I think it is by far the most entertaining book you can ever conceivably read about the Indian economy. That's, in my view, Mihir's great strength is that he not only knows the subject, cares about it, as Ninan said, there's a tremendous amount of passion. A lot of this is obviously from the heart, but that he expresses himself not only lucidly, but with an absolutely delicious wit. He is funny, he is sarcastic, he is acerbic, and he's sometimes just, in a very nice way, silly. I mean, there's one, one of these people who actually takes the trouble to read footnotes of books I read. So early on in the book, I looked up footnote 2, and the entire footnote consisted of the sentence, "I want to emphasize I'm not making any of this up." That was the footnote. And I have now put a bookmark on the footnotes. I'm reading the book without reading them, but at the end I want to go back and just match all the footnotes to because the footnotes are gems in their own right, There's a certain sardonic humor which I think is probably the best way to treat a subject which otherwise could lead to so much frustration and despair. And the frustration is there, as Ninan points out. This is somebody who has seen both the promise and the failures of the Indian economy. He has clearly expressed his disappointment. I suspect that the three of us on this podium don't disagree very much with each other on the basic issues facing the economy, so that you're not going to get a whole lot of ideological debate here. But where I think Mihir scores over more conventional analyses is precisely in the way in which he describes his disillusionment. So that you are always entertained, even while you can sense some of the seething outrage behind some of his descriptions of crony capitalism, or his choice of words in describing certain individuals, which I won't repeat because it's a miracle he hasn't yet been sued for libel by anybody, but I'm not taking that risk myself. And at the same time, there is clearly a humane, liberal spirit from which he has approached the entire question of Indian economic reform and potential. Ninan went through that list of rules. The thing that stuck in my head, in fact, when I read that chapter, was the continuing existence of the requirement to maintain a lime register. This goes back to the 1840s, where every factory had to have a register showing it had sufficient quantities of lime to whitewash its walls and so on. Now, obviously, no one does this anymore. No one takes it seriously anymore. But as Mihir points out, this is extremely useful for any inspector needing a quick buck. All he has to do is go to any factory and say, "Where's your lime register?" And if it's not there, a quick consideration, otherwise you'll be reported for violating the law. I mean, this is the sort of fundamental problem with the regulation of the economy that he rightly skewers, that it is full of opportunities for distortion, for corruption, for misdemeanors of various sorts by the very people who are meant to regulate it. And I think that the Lyme Register chapter was an extremely striking example of the kinds of things that we should be cutting through and cutting out of our system. The irony, of course, and I'll close there, is that diagnosis has never been the problem in India. We are always very good at figuring out what's wrong with our system. Prescription is more of a challenge. I'm going to ask Mihir when he speaks to tell us a little more about the prescription side, because we can all, I think, agree with what's wrong. At least most of us would, because he makes such a telling and compelling case about what's wrong. The problem is, so does Mr. Modi. But in 11 months, we've not seen Mr. Modi actually doing the kinds of things, abolishing the Lyme Register or cutting out any of the other regulations, that he rightly diagnoses he needs to get rid of. But anyway, all I will say is that this is a bracing book. It's absolute delight to read. And you know, if you're not the kind of person who normally reads a book on economics, this is the one for you.
Bang on. Mihir, over to you.
I think I'll just
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. That was altogether rather kind, including the implicit threat of sacking if I continue to write columns. Thank you both for coming, and thank you. I'm just going to turn this other one off.
It was mine. It was mine.
Thank you, Ananta, for Aspen, for organizing this.
It was hot the whole time. I just shouted, I guess. Sorry.
That's fine. So, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to try and read a little bit from the end of the book rather than the beginning. Normally, when I'm asked to read from this book, I tend to take some of the sort of more entertaining or angrier bits in the beginning. But I think that Shashi is right, and I think the time has come, you know, there is a certain degree to which we've all picked up on what the frustrations that I try to enumerate in the book are. And the question really is, what are the directions in which we can move to try and fix them? And I'm going to try and pick at, read something about land and about labor. All right, two of the things that I think we need to start working on, and land is very much in the news as well. So let's just talk about that. The first is about labor. Now you keep on hearing about why labor laws are important, so I thought this is a good chapter to try and explain that as far as possible. The first thing that we have to do is to complete the agenda of 1991. The reforms that began that year were about relaxing controls on product markets. We stopped telling companies what they could produce and how much of that they could produce. And we stopped forcing consumers to buy certain goods and not others, all right? But the markets for products are only half the story. Equally important are the markets for what goes into making them: labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. These are what are called factors of production. But the wrinkle is that each of these is not just a commodity. Each is also a livelihood, an entire way of life. Reforming these requires changing how millions of people live and what their plans are for their own lives. And this is not easy. And it is particularly hard if you're trying to reform an economy while claiming that you're not, which is India's preferred way of going about it. We cannot put it off any longer either. The lack of reform in these markets has meant that we simply are not productive enough. And also we are not competitive enough. Nobody in the world wants to buy things that are made in India. Changing that needs more than pretty slogans, and I'd like to point out this book was actually written before Make in India was coined, so this just came out of nowhere. All right, changing that needs more than pretty slogans, and it needs more than carving out a piece of land and calling it a special economic zone. Changing that is about ensuring that the right ingredients for vibrant companies and factories come together. And the government cannot force that. It has to create the conditions in which ordinary people can make that happen. So first, labor. Labor law reform is a phrase that we keep hearing about. And there's a good reason for that. It's because labor law reform is the biggest way, labor law is the biggest way in which the state intrudes upon factories, keeps them small and relatively unproductive. It has to go. If you run a factory, you should be able to take on extra workers when you get a big order while telling them that this is just temporary. Actually, that is exactly what happens today too. Contract workers are everywhere in certain industries, but it is both illegal and unfair. It is illegal because the Supreme Court has said that you can't have contract workers in what they say is your core business under the current law. Everyone has the option to do so, nevertheless, at the cost of being harassed by the cops and by labor inspectors. In other words, we have effortlessly found the worst of both worlds. It is the worst of both worlds, obviously, because on the one hand, you're not providing labor with the security that the court says you should, and on the other hand, because you're not providing employers the security from harassment by inspectors. And it is also unfair, because then you have permanent workers and workers on contract working the same assembly line, doing an identical job, but with one of them being paid up to 5 times the other. It takes a lot of energy to ignore that kind of unfairness. Unless unfairness is somehow sanctified by irrational belief, whether religious or ideological, it is dangerous. People cannot come face to face with it every day and remain unchanged. And the kind of unfairness produced by India's labor law is particularly pernicious. There is no reason that a contract worker can give to himself to rationalize why he is struggling and his colleague is not. There is no explanation that his foreman can give him that is satisfactory. The foreman also usually knows this. And perhaps as a consequence, the foreman is often not as brutal and arbitrary when dealing with the contract worker, almost as if to make up for the fact that the permanent worker is unfireable. It is pretty obvious how the tension inherent in these relations can escalate into confrontation or explode into violence. So first, a restrictive labor law creates unfairness and it induces violence. But that is not the only consequence. Manish Sabharwal, who runs a giant training and temp agency TeamLease, keeps on banging away at the point that every single additional job since 1991, has been in the informal sector. And he adds, these laws confiscate half of a worker's salary, labor laws, diverting it into supposed benefits that are poor value for money and that employers usually lie about providing anyway. Okay, I want to just bookmark that because I'm going to come back to that in a moment. What happens when all you can really get is an informal job, one which does not pay enough? Well, it drastically reduces the payoff to becoming employable, to use one of Sabharwal's favorite words. If I think there's decent work at the end of the time and money that I invest in my own skills, I might do it. If I know that there isn't any decent work, then I won't invest in those skills. I would rather, like my friend Prakash from Bareilly, whom we met in part 1, hang around and do odd jobs and wait for the occasional big bonanza. Sometimes a single phrase explains things best. And this life of impermanence is still summed up for me by a phrase that I remember reading long ago in a book about Gujarati laborers by the Dutch sociologist Jan Bremen. Wage hunter-gatherers. There is, as many, including Aman Sethi, have noted, a certain freedom to this life. But the possibility of investing in yourself or voluntarily giving up some freedom for a promised future does not ever arise. And the most incredible product of our restrictions, surely, is exactly how much they stifle innovation and growth. The World Bank looked at firms in the US and India decades apart. In the US, they found that 35-year-old companies had, on average, grown 10 times on 2 crucial indicators. They sold 10 times as much, and they employed 10 times as many people over those 35 years. But in India, the productivity of a 35-year-old firm merely doubles, while its headcount actually falls by a 1/4. In other words, old firms actually lay off workers. Larger firms are better most of the time. They provide more benefits and higher wages for their employees. They are capable of more innovation, according to that study from the World Bank, and they compete better in global markets. That is for firms with over 100 people. But remember, in India, between 80 and 90% of manufacturing companies employ less than 50 people, and most employ less than 10. So, I sort of return to the point a little later, saying that we keep on banging about the size of the Indian market, but we have more hungry producers than we have potential consumers. This means that we must, humbly instead of arrogantly, try to look at what people would want to buy from us that we could make. Instead of arrogantly proclaiming the strength and depth of the Indian market, humbly ask what our weak industry can make for the rest of the world. What can we do for you, not can what you do for us? In our arrogance and self-delusion, in this national machismo that compensates for decades of being ignored, we think our job is to sell the India story. No, it is not. Our job is to sell Indian goods. And for that to happen, we cannot be arrogant and we cannot think small. The fear is that we will settle for just tinkering. India's government, I believe, also has a righteous anger about India's horrific red tape. Prime Minister Modi has talked about the Inspector Raj. He has said that he would be happy if we repealed one bad law a day. But action is harder. Consider this, of all those labor laws that hold back manufacturing, the central government has repealed practically none. What it has said is that it will ensure the nice, kindly man, the labor law inspector, will harass you less, because there is a website on which he will submit his report. And I'm not making this up. I think we can all agree this is classic tinkering. The one thing that they have done since I have written this book is to change some of those laws that I talked about that Manish Sabharwal had pointed to, which take a large proportion of everyone's salary and puts them into provident funds. Okay? They've ensured that smaller companies no longer have to do that so often. It may be the case then that you see at the lower end of the market over the next few years slight growth in the number of formal employees because it raises people's return to formal employment, but it's not, we haven't seen the results of that yet. Anyway, so that was about labor. And I just want to read a little bit about land as well, because again, land is about something that, clearly we know what we need to do. Next, land. If anything, this has been the most fraught of disputes in India. We are an incredibly crowded country, and this has been getting worse as too few people leave agriculture, and farms just keep on getting divided into smaller and smaller portions. Frequently, land is the only asset that people have, the only thing they know keeps them from destitution. They have no skills, they have no safe deposit box, and they have no bank account, but they do have a patch of land. Many people understand exactly how land translates into security. But if you give them a fixed deposit in a bank instead, they just do not feel as secure. On the other hand, you do have the unquestionable need to build more factories and the somewhat more questionable need to open up more land to mining. Some of those who worry about land acquisition ask, why can't industries just be built on barren land, on faraway land, or on less fertile land, less irrigated land? There is one problem to this. Barren, less fertile, and less productive land is frequently further away from population centers and road networks. If you think about it, you will realize this is not, in fact, a coincidence. So if you are going to build more factories that are profitable, you cannot restrict them to barren land. And the final problem is that this is an area where individuals alone cannot write contracts with each other and get things done easily. Building a factory frequently means getting together several parcels of land. And let's say you get 90% of the landowners of the vicinity on board while paying a reasonable amount to them, one they're happy with. Suppose the remaining 10%, out of irrationality or maybe out of greed, refuse to part with their land until the price is 10, 15, 20 times higher, or 100 times higher. Clearly, there's an impasse here, and this is something that the economists call the hold-up problem. And it is one that states throughout history have solved by stepping in with overwhelming force. Right. So India's solution used to be to just allow the state to take over everything it wanted on behalf of anyone it wanted for any purpose at all, as long as it could be vaguely defined as public. And so many things can be, In a chronically housing-starved country, even housing projects with 17 swimming pools can be claimed to serve a public purpose if the bureaucrat in question is daring enough. You can get away with this sort of thing if you're a colonizing imperial power, which is when the original land acquisition law was drafted, but give us about 70 years of freedom and we might begin to push back. People were furious, many because they didn't want to give up their only asset for what was not enough money, others because they didn't want to give up their only asset for any money at all, others because they wanted a job at the factory or equity in the factory or to be resettled in the neighborhood, and an infinitesimal minority because they really wanted to stay farmers and to stay farming that particular specific patch of land. Naturally, most of the sympathetic coverage focused on that last bunch. This is how the media operates, and it is useless to complain because that bunch gave us the best story, human interest and all, never mind that they may not be representative. What are we, social scientists? And so now we have a different law. This was written before the Modi amendments. This one, according to Shonjoy Chakravarti of Temple University, will ensure that nowhere in India will land be cheaper than 25 lakh rupees an acre, or in other words, between 50 and 100 times more expensive than it was 10 years ago. One begins to suspect that we may have overcompensated. And it is not just the price. There is an entire phalanx of bureaucrats that you will have to go through to sell or buy that land, all evaluating and inspecting and certifying and identifying. At the very least, this will delay you, and at the worst, it will also further escalate your cost. Look, you obviously need to have something in the middle, naturally a higher price than before, equally naturally not a 100-fold increase. And again, you need to keep the state's actual participation to a minimum. It may be essential to solve the hold-up problem, to get the government to come in at the last minute and be persuasive in the way that only people with armies can. But it is also true that this should happen as little and as late as possible. In other words, get more people willing to sell. And the truth is that people will only be willing to sell when there is a real market for agricultural land. People have to get used to the idea of land as something you can buy and sell, not something that you inherit and hold on to. The time when we could have redistributed land properly has sadly passed. We failed to reform land holdings when we should and could have, and the states that did so, that did redistribute land then, are now much less abjectly poor. But if the others restart that process now, we will just end up making land holdings even smaller and less viable. The only thing to do is to move towards a genuine market in land. We do not have a market in land for two reasons, the two things that need to be removed. The first is that we are never sure who owns what. Seriously. Local Indian papers sometimes have advertisements in which people assert their rights over one little piece of land or another by claiming to have documents in Persian going back centuries. Sometimes they need to do that in order to mortgage or sell land that has been with their family for generations. They have no actual land deed. There is no register of land. One is being made, but it is proceeding at the speed universally associated with 90-year-old ladies on the pavement. It needs to speed up, and once finished, it needs to be completely paperless, ideally online and accessible to everyone. And the second and possibly more pressing reason that we don't have a market in land is because it is illegal. This is considered a good idea. See, otherwise farmers might be exploited. City slickers would turn up and offer them some cash for their land, and then farmers, being, according to these people, incurably naive and unable to see the real value of their only asset, would give them the land, and then the city slickers would resell it to other city slickers for a vast sum of money. This would be exploitation, and the only way to stop it is to ban any sale of farmland to anyone other than someone else wanting to farm. Oh, and that person better not already have any land. Excellent. Small problem. What happens now is as a city seeker just buys the land at an agricultural price, claiming to farm it, gets a cousin in the capital to declare that, or somebody who owes their job to his mother-in-law, to declare that patch of land is now industrial or residential, and then sells it on to the developer at a vast markup. You see, in an effort to protect the farmer, we have effectively ensured that he gets very little of the value of any of the land he sells. And you should have figured out by now, this is pretty typical for Indian law. Change these two things and develop a market for land, and much will be improved. People are willing to sell. Earlier in 2014, I stood by a well-laid-out rural road in what would have been, a few years earlier, a pretty inaccessible part of eastern UP. I was prodding the men by the side of the road as to whether they sent their daughters to school. They were offended, I needed to ask. What did I think they were, people from Western UP? They were even okay, they pointed out, with their girls getting jobs after they graduated. But where were their jobs, they added morosely, the usual complaint. It would be nice, said one, if there were a few factories here. I snorted at this. Surely they would be the first people to complain if their land was taken away for a factory. They laughed and then got up and walked me up and down the verge of the road, pointing out to the fields that they felt were unprofitable or from which people were ready to sell and to build a factory. People, they insisted, were ready to sell. But companies are not ready to buy that easily. Companies have been spoiled by governments falling over backwards to give them land that has been expropriated for them from their owners. And have you noticed how much they ask for? Thousands of acres, vast tracts of land to put up one factory. For these guys, a land crisis does not exist. They want to build a park-like industrial township to produce 5 cars a day. All right, this is actually, what the nano approach was. Go to Stuttgart or Yokohama and see how much space they use up to build 500 cars a day. And once again, you realize that the Indian private sector needs a smidgen of sense to be delivered unto them. Look at the famous Infosys campus in Bangalore. Can someone explain to me why a software company, which really could operate out of everyone's networked living rooms, needs a tract of land that one normally associates with airports or small European tax havens? It is big enough for a bowling alley and heaven knows what else. So don't give them vast campuses. Let them buy on the open market and force them to pay well, but not exorbitantly. The answer is simple. It's just admitting it that's hard. And I just want to say, as a sort of follow-up to this, today in the newspaper, I think there was news that ArcelorMittal is finally pulling out of a project in Jharkhand, in Gumla district of Jharkhand, right? And I was completely shocked by the size of what they had demanded. It was, I think, I tried to calculate, approximately a quarter the size of the South Delhi parliamentary constituency of what they had expected to build their entire campus on, and they expected this would just be handed to them. Anyway, so that's broadly, those are the two chapters that I want to read, one about land, one about labor. They're both kind of in the news. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that right now we're in the middle of a discussion about the land acquisition law, all right? A lot of people have staked out extreme positions or even positions that are not necessarily the best solutions to the problem. If Narendra Modi, for example, wanted to a solution on land that would help a lot of people but would not necessarily lead to disruptions in parliament, he should have from day one started focusing on ensuring that a land register was complete by his second year in office. That would have vastly helped everyone. Okay, there are a bunch of such things that could be changed which are not yet extreme political positions, and I'd love to see those being taken up.
Thank you, Mihir. I thought 20 states had completed digitization of land records.
They haven't actually. 6 have, I think.
All but 6 have.
No, is it the other? No.
No, it's the lower number. 6 is,
Yeah?
there's Andhra Pradesh, there's
From Karnataka.
Karnataka.
Yeah, Karnataka started earlier.
Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Goa, I think, and possibly, not even Kerala has completed it.
Kerala, the last one to do it. Okay, Shashi, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to ask you, which government do you think is more likely to do the kind of things that Mihir Sharma wants you to do?
I think the Narasimha Rao government would have been
Today.
All right. But look, I mean, the thing is that we have a government. And it's a government which, in many ways, campaigned on this kind of diagnosis. These are things that are wrong in the economy.
But then you call them suit boot. So they retreat in a hurry.
I have a piece today on indiatv.com on why I've called them suit boot. I mean, why I think suit boot ki sarkar is something they brought on themselves. But the fact is that looking at the specific reforms that we've been discussing, it requires a certain amount of political courage, but it also requires a certain amount of political adeptness. I mean, it's not as if they're facing some sort of implacable wall of opposition. There are issues that can get through. It's often forgotten that they passed, there are 7 ordinances, right? And 5 of those have passed as law since then. So it's not as if everything has been opposed all the time. But where they seem to be politically tone deaf, obviously the opposition exists to exploit that. Let me say, though, that things like, as you said, a simple thing like mandating land registration, a serious look again at labor laws. I mean, Rajasthan showed it could be done. Some of the not just incremental reforms that they're very manifestly shying away from could have been embraced. Whether they felt that they didn't want to expend the political capital this early in their tenure, whether they are not themselves very convinced about it, whether they have just eased too comfortably into the trappings of the political establishment remains to be seen. But I mean, certainly all of those explanations are plausible. The one thing that they haven't convinced anybody of is they really want to change the kinds of things that they said on the stump they would change.
And then if you came back into office, do you think your government would do it?
We have to wait and see who the finance minister is, who the prime minister is. No, look, obviously the Congress is a big tent. There are certainly voices within the Congress that would want to do all of this and that in fact tried to make a stab at doing it. And in the case of those who were there in 91, like Manmohan Singh, did it. But there's also countervailing forces. There are also people who still have a different view of the economy and who in fact helped build the system that Mihir is skewering here. And ultimately it will depend on the balance of forces within any new government as to which view prevails. I think increasingly, though, the area of consensus has shifted more towards the center. And increasingly, as we saw during the United Front governments in the mid-90s, there was a surprising continuity in the sort of reforms already accomplished, even though those governments had the CPI having members in it. I mean, this was quite astonishing when you think about it. And yet it worked. So I would like to think that if the this government or whichever government is in office were to move the bar a little bit, I don't think that a new government come in and move it back. I think in India we tend to see these things as what the French call acquis. It's done, now let's move on. We may move more slowly or in a slightly more angular direction, but we will move on. And this has been the elephant metaphor I was accused of using too much. I mean, basically, the elephant may be slow to turn, but it usually plods on remorselessly in the same direction. And the fact that every political party in India, with the exception of the CPM, has actually tasted office, and in the case of the CPM has also tasted power in the last 25 years. And still, nothing has been rolled back from 91, suggests that reforms are irreversible, and therefore, anything that this government is to do now is unlikely to be pulled back.
Mihir, what do you think?
Well, I think the one thing that is very interesting on labor laws is that labor laws in particular, is that I looked at the questions that were asked to the Minister for Labor in this current session, just to see what are the questions. And so there are a lot of questions, of course, about the provident funds. There always are. People are sort of fascinated whether it's, and terrified about the prospect of private management of it. So, but there were about 8 or maybe 10 different MPs who asked questions about the liberalization of labor law and did the government have any plans for it? What is the status of those plans? Would it not improve factories? And I mean, they were very clearly coming at it from a pro labor law reform perspective. And almost all of them were from the South. This is true. But
and there probably were more than the 10 because, there's a lottery.
Yes, exactly.
I asked this question, mine was not picked.
Well, there you go. So, but what was very clear was that they were almost all from non-BJP parties as it happened, maybe because of the South North. So there were people from the TRS, there were people from the TDP, there were people from the JDS, there were several from the Congress, and there were 1 or 2 from the BJP as well. And I do get the sense that it's not the case that the Congress is dead set against it, at least if it listens to its own MPs. What does stick in my mind is that Rahul Gandhi, to whatever extent Rahul Gandhi has, stays with things that he has said in the past, has come out and said that, addressing, I think CII or FICC, I can't remember which, saying that, obviously we need flexible labor laws. That goes without saying, and then moved on to talking about something else. So he said that, and if you look at their 2 manifestos, both the BJP and the Congress has actually promised greater flexibility. I mean, they said we will do it, whereas the BJP said we will have a consultation of stakeholders. So there is a difference. I mean, therefore I would look to this as being something that is possible. There is a consensus for at the center. Definitely the number of states that seem to be doing it on their own suggests Haryana, when it was still a Congress state, started doing it. MP is trying to do it. Rajasthan, of course, as we know, just declared that it had done it and got the president to sign it. So I think there is a political acceptance of this.
Okay, one of the running themes through your book is about the failure to get manufacturing going, and that's where the jobs can be created, to get people off the land and so on. What if I were to put to you that this is not going to happen?
This is not
Not going to happen.
It will not happen. It is too late. Your macroeconomic balances are such that your service exports and your export of people together generate a certain number of dollars, which keep the rupee at a level which makes it impossible to compete in manufacturing. It's too late to compete in the labor-intensive areas. It's automation is taking that advantage away in any case, and all the hope of doing in East Asia, including China, 20 or 30 years later, is simply not going to happen.
Well, I would hope that it's not. It may be the case about automation. I think we don't know the direction in which technology will go. It isn't automation, in fact, that worries me as much as 3D printing does. I mean, the fear really, it is, but not sort of robotic kind of thing, but the possibility that at some point, 5 years from now, all the stuff that is currently made cheaply in the Pearl River Delta will actually be made for us by the equivalent of our neighborhood STD guy or a neighborhood Xerox guy. You walk down there with a blueprint on a USB, give it to him, and he'll produce, a couple of soap dishes for you, or whatever it is that you want to buy, that is a little terrifying because it does mean that there is a trade-off in value between labor and whichever giant company is producing those 3D printers. That's a little scary. So yes, I'm not going to deny the possibility that technology might leave the idea of large-scale manufacturing behind. I am a little more hopeful that at some point we will just wake up and realize that we have to do things to the rupee that force it lower, whatever it may be. I mean, if necessary.
Nobody in government or the Reserve Bank thinks so.
At some point, I mean, maybe with the next governor, maybe with the next finance minister.
Okay, if I were to take that up with you, you would have to be then doing an aggressive mercantilist rupee policy, which I don't think our policy establishment is capable of continuing.
Not to mention that we will promptly play clips on television of Mr. Modi's sarcastic speeches about how the rupee was one to the dollar.
Which it never was.
It was 5 actually, but anyway, he said in 1947 it was 1 to the dollar, and now, 67 years later, 67, so when he comes back, he's going to raise the value. We will remind him of that, of course.
Of course you will, and you're right to remind him. But we're still faced with the problem that
I agree with you. The current establishment doesn't look.
Economic situation where, except high value added manufacturing,
it doesn't seem that we are
quality engineering or stuff where a little more intelligence is required and a little more capital is invested, then it's not labor intensive anymore.
My answer
to
to
that, but you can't do the across the board manufacturing revival that so much of writing and literature now talks about as something that we should do.
My answer to that, my suggestion to that would be like, okay, maybe it's not certain that that's going to happen, but if you free up the choices that entrepreneurs can make and you give them access to global markets anyway, even if that turns out to be unprofitable, they might figure out something else, and that is our best shot.
Well, I think what you will get then is supporting services coming up around that kind of manufacturing.
Entirely possible.
But it will still be services.
Entirely possible. Entirely possible. I think that if technology goes the way that you're suggesting it does, and if we can't fix the rupee, that might be what happens. But we won't get even that unless we do the minimum.
And then we're looking at it from this side and saying, all those young guys who need jobs and labor. But what do the young guys themselves want? As the Skills Development Corporation finds, no young guy wants to be trained for any blue-collar work. All they want to be trained in is white-collar work. They want to sit in an air-conditioned office and operate a phone or a computer, or be at a sales counter in a shop, or standing in some place in a hotel as a service guy. That's what they want. And the whole industrial culture thing is something they don't want to have anything to do with. So those guys are not looking for those kind of jobs.
Yeah, now that is a question that I think I do actually raise in the book about the sort of cultural dislike of the idea of manual labor.
Yes.
Now, I don't know whether this is something that can be overcome. I think...
And people, it's been demonstrated that people, especially in Kerala, are prepared to take a 50% pay cut to give up a blue-collar job and get a white-collar job.
Now, this is something that the Prime Minister...
And then import the blue-collar workers from Bihar and Orissa, which is what we're doing in Kerala.
Absolutely. Yes.
As long as somebody is willing to do it, we have markets.
Yes.
So this is something the Prime Minister, I think, has actually pointed to and has said is something that he's worried about. It has that sort of behavioral edge of the kind of thing that he tends to be interested by. And he has said that there will be a shram seva. I think there is a change in attitude of employers towards employees that might help it happen. There's a larger change in attitude that accepts that people working with their hands may not, it doesn't automatically mean that you are losing certain, I don't want to use the word caste, but it's caste in the end.
I think that caste is involved, but also the marriage market.
Yeah, that's true.
You may get a useless BA degree as opposed to getting a properly qualified, specialist worker category thing where you get much more money and you have a proper job. But in the marriage market, you lose out because your prospective father-in-law wants a graduate son-in-law. And he's not interested in some fellow's son-in-law.
I think one of the things has to be the idea that there'll have to be some kind of demonstration effect here. The idea that if you can, let's say you're one of these kids from Gorakhpur and you know of a cousin who has a comfortable job in a factory somewhere on the West Coast. all right? And that kind of comfortable job, which is, it's not necessarily the kind of hellholes that we have in Manesar where, people are losing their arms half the time and, nobody cares. But a slightly better run factory, one in which even if he gets fired, he could get a job at another factory down the road, and in which he has lived reasonably with a family in the same location. That kind of demonstration effect that this is a job that has dignity is something that might change this. I think one of the reasons why we see this difference in how blue-collar and white-collar jobs are viewed is because most blue-collar jobs, unless I think you're working for PSU, don't provide you with the level of dignity that people are searching for. I think you're...
There's an interesting statistic in your book about Maruti Udyog making 2,400 crore profit and be prepared to face a worker riot to prevent them getting 24 crores. Is that your figure?
That's true, yeah.
Now that whole worker issue and payment and violence and all was over 24 crores for a company that's making 2,000.
They were just repatriating 2,400 crores just for the right to use the name Suzuki.
That's right. So, and then they object to giving...
quite preposterous.
So, anyway, I think we've done a discussion here. I'd like to throw this open to the floor. Questions, preferably rather than comments. Brevity, please. And who you are so that everybody in the room knows where you're coming from. Kiran, the mic's around? Yes. Okay. Yeah, sure. Yes, please.
I'm Raghu Karnara, I'm a journalist. Thank you. Very interesting conversation. The one thing that I find might be missing is the political economy question of what moves reform may not just be the intellectual arguments and accepting them, but the pattern of rent-seeking in the economy that already exists. So, I mean, I think you need to discuss what the motives might be within political parties, among legislators, for disrupting the rent-seeking that might have brought them to power.
Well, I mean, there are vested interests up and down the system, no question about it. But nonetheless, I think you perhaps may be a little unfair in discounting the value of persuasive argument. After all, in 91, it did work. And one of the reasons it worked is that people were widely convinced there was no choice. Yeah. It's not as if those who were in
Parliament... The party was not convinced.
Many were. I mean, the ones who had...
They opposed it in every single meeting.
But at the end it passed. And one of the reasons it passed is, of course, the Prime Minister basically said, A, we have no choice. Even if you are personally profiting from the system that we are about to dismantle, sorry, if we don't, something worse awaits us. And I think, ultimately that sense of urgency, that sense of commitment has a political logic that is independent of vested interest. I mean, if Mr. Modi truly believed, as he could have, that the mandate he got was a reflection of his aspirational message and his reformist message, and then decided to act on that mandate by doing all the things that he implied on the stump he would do, we might already be in a different story today. Instead of merely sort of ascending to power and office and relishing the trappings thereof and adding to it with a pinstripe suit, which created the Soot Boot Ki Sarkar metaphor for us in the opposition, there wasn't a willingness to undertake the hard yards and the stuff that could have been done, which he could have justified in terms of his mandate. So it's an interesting political challenge there, but the fact is that he did have the mandate.
Okay, one there, two there, and then we'll come in front. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Kunal from Center for Policy Research. One question is to Mihir. We often talk about labor laws when we talk of labor and not skills. So what do you think has been the benefit of making this Ministry of Skills by Modi? And its performance so far, what do you think about it? And we often mix skills with higher education, but I'll mix it here because Dr. Tharoor was minister. So all of our universities are producing unemployable graduates, except IITs, IIMs, which are ruled by different acts, not by UGC. You made this university, forgetting this name, which is ruled by Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Oh, you mean Nalanda University?
Nalanda University.
And South Asia, two of them, yeah.
Right. So why not just bundle this HRD ministry so that education can be improved and HRD minister will remain out of news?
Personally, I have no problem with that. I mean, within the system, I have argued for quite some time that our education is over-regulated and under-governed. And what we need really is, for example, the kind of role the UGC has taken upon itself is absurd. We tried to put forward a reform that would have abolished both the UGC and the AICTE and replaced them with an overarching Council for Higher Education, which would have played more of an accrediting role. We also tried to introduce a number of bills that would have liberated the intellectual space, the educational space, allowed even the private sector to create universities, the Universities for Innovation Bill, allowed foreign universities to come in. Every one of these bills was thwarted by the people who are today in power. So I don't know what vision they have, but certainly the first year has not been encouraging. In fact, they've used the UGC to impose a certain, even less imaginative system of regulation on the universities than the one that we were trying to loosen. And whatever autonomy we were able to promote in recent years during UPA is now being stifled in this government. So I do worry very much about the direction in which this is going. But I have no intellectual difficulty with saying we can completely dismantle much of the structures. We probably still need a grant-giving capacity because there is a dependence on tax money to get a lot of these things done, much more than, say, in the US system. But short of that, the sort of top-down regulatory thing where you actually have UGC rules that tell everybody how many acres a university campus must have, how many classrooms, what the size of the classroom must be, how many teachers, how many of each caste, what kind of salary they should. I mean, all of this has simply become absurd and onerous, and simply doesn't respect the kind of intellectual freedom and flowering that comes with autonomy.
So just on your question of skills, I think that the creation of a separate ministry wasn't a particular. It basically needed somebody to, Mr. Ninan may correct me if I'm wrong, to run the skills mission, and which already existed.
It was scattered through 19 ministries, and therefore you needed one.
It was necessary. A reasonable thing. Yeah. But the problem seems to be that in the end, getting, and Mr. Ninan knows a little bit more about this, for some reason, the private sector just did not sit down with the last government at least and try and help design the ITI setup and help improve the syllabus so in such a way that it actually, vocational training turned out people that were actually employable and turned out enough of them. And I can't imagine why this kept on happening. There was some kind of rigidity there that I have not been able to understand. I don't know.
No, we threw up the challenge to the private sector, but I'm afraid they didn't respond. It's always startled me why we don't have more private sector involvement in vocational training, because they themselves will benefit from any of it.
And they complain regularly that they can't get reasonable people, but it seems that, and you know, when I was younger, you always heard about graduate trainees being the thing to do, right? You took somebody who didn't know much, and you put them into a job, and you invested to a year and a half in which they were like walking into walls or whatever it is that people just out of college do.
But you didn't have the same labor mobility in those days, so you could invest in people.
Maybe you're scared of this, you know, you need to
they're worried that you train somebody, he'll go off for a better salary somewhere else.
But
that
doesn't somehow fit with the idea that they also simultaneously complaining they can't hire anyone. So, you know, there must be some kind of media. Also, Raghu, on the political economy bit, I'd just like to add to what Shashi says, that sometimes there are just these moments where people realize they have to give up a certain source of rent seeking. I think on coal, for example, we figured out that a lot of people fought a rearguard effort that was very powerful for about 8-10 years after 2004, and then eventually things just became unmanageable. And it became such a big scandal that things had to change. That happened in a lot of mining. This happened in a lot of mining things. UPA 2 also did not change something called the requirement for the reservation for small sector industries. There were only 24 things left on that list between 2009 to 2014. And these were sectors that were kept for either small-scale industries, so industries that employed people under 20, or people that had been manufacturing in that sector since 1967. And you would look at this and say, why can't you just end this thing right now, all right, and take this off the books? And the reason they didn't, apparently, was because two of those things were matches and fireworks. And the political economy of matches and fireworks, when you have support, that you need support from a Tamil Nadu party, is very, very specific. Suddenly you have a situation where, no, you don't need support from a Tamil Nadu party, and it's happened. So that's the...
Yes, at the back.
Akshay Jaitley, I'm a lawyer. Just coming back to the reference to elephants earlier, the one that I feel is in the room is that of administrative reform. And it's also got a reference to rent seeking. Now, the reforms in '92 were very sort of top-down reforms, and they could be put into place without encroaching very much on the space of the bureaucracy. And I'm not just talking about the IAS, despite the fact that I'm the son of such a person, but also through the system. Now, the next round of reforms, when you talk about labor reforms, you've got a rent-seeking system in place which involves bureaucracy. And again, low-level bureaucracy all the way up high. The ability to institute reforms, and I'm not letting this government off the hook, is so dependent on administrative reform, which is something that we just have given up on, it would seem. And I'm talking about it in two ways. One, we live in a time and in an economy which requires a skill set that current administrators, however brilliant, just don't have the training for. And secondly, you have a job for life, so you're not measured on performance. So just a question to the panel as to how that might or might not be the determining factor to getting the next set of reforms in place.
You should go on this one, Mr. Ninan.
You're the author. You answer.
Well, I would not only would I not let this government off the hook, I think this is something where the UPA really failed.
Oh, wait a minute. We have Mr. Moili's 1,000-page administrative reform.
Which nobody in your government read.
Quite right.
And it
So we will invite Mr.
a
Modi.
lot of good suggestions. Nobody read it.
I think that in his defense, I suspect the Prime Minister read it.
I doubt it.
Yes, but it is definitely.
So we've done the groundwork. All we need now is to implement it. And that was the challenge for the government.
First big speech that Manmohan Singh gave in 2004 was, and in fact, the only real promise he made as Prime Minister in his first year about what he would implement was administrative reform.
Correct.
And then he gave it to Mr. Moily, who then took 5 years. And by the time that it is a tough subject, but eventually by the time the report came in, the next elections are due, and then it was UPA 2, and it was like just we know what happened. But
no, Mr. Moily says some were implemented, but what percentage, I'm not sure. Probably
not a lot. I can tell you that I had a grandfather who was a civil servant, and sometime in the dim past, when he was a young civil servant, and and the world was new, and Nehru was around, he worked on the first Administrative Reforms Committee, and rather entertainingly, a lot of what he suggested in the first Administrative Reforms Committee is still sort of hanging fire. I was in Mr. Moily's report, and is still kind of needed. So this is, for example, to return things to the news, we're in the middle right now of an investigation as to how it could be the case that various companies have large amounts of paper that is technically top secret from various ministries in Delhi. Incidentally, in case you haven't noticed, this law, the legal case has now been changed. The companies are no longer defendants. They are now officially victims of the crime. Okay, just in case you didn't notice that. That was on page 13 of the Times of India yesterday.
Victims of which crime, sorry?
Of the crime of stealing things from the oil ministry and so on and so forth. Yes, it turns out that they're victims now. But anyway, so to return to the point, when
the opposition is not alert, I feel.
But clearly on this one, I missed it, sir. But then,
but
going
always
to
read page 13 of the Times of India. So, but the reason why there's so much paper floating around, as it happens, is because of, and Mr. Ninan is the one who directed me to this, officer-based versus office-based file notings. Do you want to sort of explain this?
No.
Okay, fine. You want. But there is a way in which you can have a piece of paper that belongs to an office or a piece of paper that belongs to a particular officer. If it belongs to an officer, it is much more secure, and people have been recommending this change since the 1950s, and it has not yet happened.
But if the officer is transferred regularly, at least the paper remains in the office.
Now we have hard drives.
Yes, please.
I'll have to leave after this one.
Yeah.
I'm Anup Bose. I'm a senior advocate, Supreme Court of India, and a special advisor to Tata Consultancy Services. Mihir very aptly talked about obsolete and archaic laws and shared with us the delightful illustration of the Lime Register. But I think Mihir will agree with me that whether you wish to amend, end, or mend the the laws, you have to go through the rigmarole of having it passed by both houses of parliament. And you will probably recall that even after an act is passed by, and even you receives presidential sanction like the Industrial Disputes Act, underwent major changes, but are still to see the light of day. In this context, would you suggest a different approach, the approach of a judge-made law or a judicially activated law? You would probably recall the case of the National Textile case, where the Supreme Court of India said that even if the workers don't have a right to be impleaded in a winding up petition, under the law, they must be given the right. So the Supreme Court went beyond the frontiers of or the four corners of the statute and gave workers a right that was not there in the Act. And that is where I think the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, have to play the role of the crusader. That is where I would like you, and that is where we can sort of overcome the problem that we face in amending laws in the time it takes. And finally, I would like to compliment Shashi for the very laudatory remark that he made about my father figure, Mr. Narasimha Rao, because I had the privilege of working very closely with him, and I used to very often stay with him, and I remember that he had a highly digitalized computer room in those days next to his bedroom, and he used to operate out of that room sometimes into the wee hours of the night. Thank you.
I think we'll take one from here as you wanted to ask a question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Utkarsh. I work for Microsoft. You mentioned that labor laws and having them flexible is one side of the equation, but skilling, and I think that technology will be a huge disruption into the workforce of tomorrow. So do you think the Make in India campaign and is the government prepared for that kind of disruption? And if not, what are some of the key steps that can be taken in such a direction?
Okay, one by one. First, on the courts. Well, I think that part of I don't want to in any way underplay the many good things that we've got thanks to the Supreme Court, which has played a very, very important activist role in looking at workers' rights and many other things. I think in fact, the problem is in the example that I gave there is a point beyond which, if the Supreme Court meddles, I won't say meddles, but
Judicial overreach, I think.
is not really set up to do. So it may come up with the wrong policies. And it is entirely possible that if it does this, because it is judge-made law, we will not be able to change it. Because if the Supreme Court takes a decision, then it goes beyond any correction. So it is also, it may make the wrong thing, it likely will, and it could go, once it does that, short of pleading to with the Supreme Court again, there's nothing much you can do. So I think there are genuine dangers to that, and you cannot shortcut this, the parliamentary process, however dysfunctional it may be. It is just too
Can I just chip in on that, and then I really will have to slip away? Just to say that courts have a very useful purpose in interpreting laws, but it's laws they interpret. The laws are still the bedrock of change, and in a democracy, only elected representatives should be writing laws. So the bottom line remains, the Supreme Court, for example, can suggest certain things, can point to certain anomalies, can open up certain directions. But then to make it law, you have to be able to go back to the elected representatives of the people, because in a democracy, it's what the political traffic will bear that governs us, and not, frankly, unelected, appointed people in a particular position. That's why judicial overreach can be a real issue. Now, obviously, if the judges say something or even interpret something in a way that the parliament is unable to agree to overturn, then it becomes the new political consensus. So, I mean, Keshavananda Bharati, for example, the whole notion of right to property underwent a change in the courtroom, which is then accepted in the political establishment. That could happen on other issues. But the political establishment is where that acceptance or rejection will eventually matter, and it's where the laws must be made. Good luck with the rest of us.
I think one respond here, and then there's one or two there, and we'll close.
I didn't answer Utkarsh on skills, so I just quickly take that on skills and digital stuff. Yeah, sure. I mean, Make in India is, to the extent that it's like, as Mr. Ninan said, it's focused on a slightly older paradigm of like, let's make these big factories which have chuck things working. Yeah, maybe it doesn't take into account the possibility of digital disruption. On the other hand, the one thing that the government is doing that is this sort of, Mr. Modi calls it a digital India thing, but it's completing a project that is already in the pipeline Nripendra Mishra, who's his principal secretary, in fact, had worked on earlier, which is on ensuring that rural India is connected through its panchayats with proper broadband and, and as well as each village having access to a certain bundle of electronic services. My assumption is you give people broadband, maybe you give people 3G in rural areas, you give them really cheap smartphones, and you give them a basic set of things that they can do relatively cheaply online, they'll figure it out themselves. I mean, beyond that, I don't think the government needs to worry about it. If there is something, if there's a digital disruption that comes along and people can make money from it, I guess a bunch of people who have access to that in India will be able to do it. So nothing we need to worry about.
Okay, we'll take 2 questions and then we'll close. Yes, please.
I'm Vijay Kaul, a management consultant and activist. My question is, wonderful points that you have raised, and they are all crucial to our economy. Each person of India should be made aware of these facts. But what we see, the role of media, mostly who influences each individual, and therefore the various policies are made. We find the media, particularly the television media, wasting time on frivolous issues and not really taking up issues like you have raised today. I think we should be discussing on the television channels such issues rather than who said what and what information was leaked. So with the result that what is happening, media is shaping public opinion in totally wrong channels, and that results in finally electing the wrong kind of representatives and the wrong kind of government.
Okay, and the gentleman in the back? I'll come back to you. Okay. Yeah.
I don't need
to. Okay.
So just a brief comment.
Introduce yourself, please.
Introduce myself, right. Avi Singh, I'm also an advocate. We've had a few. Just a comment on your judicial comment. I think economics is too serious a subject to be left to economists, and certainly our constitutional scheme grants judges through the directive principles and economic jurisprudence. But I won't go further than that in commenting on what you said. But I want to just focus, because I haven't read your book, but I heard you today, on your comments with regard to titles. The digitization, of course, of land records won't give titles in India, but what you're really saying is if we had titles, we would improve market efficiency, if I may paraphrase, which would be good. And my question to you, which is going to be in the form, as you would expect, of a critique, is going to be that this dystopian idea of improving titleization, hence improving market efficiency, has had very significant political economic critique from both left and right. And so while you present it as a win-win from, if the rent seekers and everybody who's just too silly to see this would just get out of the way and we can do this, there's serious political economics that needs to go into granting people title over land, which is, of course, granting somebody significant economic resources, while currently you really have, at best, title qua somebody else in India. You don't really have perpetual title. So is it not what we need more is, I agree with the earlier commenter, more serious political debate, more serious discussions on what advantages, and because it's not just a win-win situation, but often a win-lose, rather than just everybody seeing the light of market efficiency and arriving at that. So more politics, not less.
Okay, and last question here, first row. You have the mic.
S.S. Bhakhri from Institute of UN and UNESCO Studies. We just like to know whether in your latest magnum opus, you have also touched the question of widening chasm between the richest and the poorest in India as also of the world, and the income ratio of the lowest paid and the highest paid CEO here as also in the world. And if you have suggested what they call in French some Dukes ex machina, how to bridge this gap. Today, 80 billionaires of the world, their income is equivalent to the total GDP of India, around 1.9 trillion, are equal to the income of the poorest half of the population of the whole world, 3.5 billion. Is this issue also stands, commented, discussed in your work?
Get the
Thank
point.
you.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to take the media one?
No, you take media, you take everything.
Okay, on the media, look, we're going to do what people watch, I think, or, I think that if you want some, a better media, pay for it. I think that if you're going to expect that an ad-supported media paid for by somebody else is not going to go, chasing eyeballs, they're going to do that. They're going to do what is cheap. People fighting on TV is cheap, and people fighting entertainingly on TV gets the eyeballs. So why would they not do this? It's straightforward.
That's only one kind of media. There are
and
other
of course,
kinds
there
of
are very, very important. Please read the editorial page of the Business Standard, where genuine debate takes place at the highest possible level. So,
that's a commercial.
That's a great tragedy. Please tell all your friends. Yes. Yeah, but no, I agree with you. I think that's there are good stories done, not just in the business. There are good discussions that take place, not just in the Business Standard, but in a lot of other newspapers. And please ask the chairman. So, on the other point of land title. So. No, I don't think that there's a win-lose, win-win thing here. The DeSoto thing fundamentally was the claim that if you give people the right to what they own, suddenly they will have capital and they will behave as capitalists. I think that idea has had holes shot in it, quite rightly. But that's not the argument that I'm making as to why we need sort of a title right now. We need title as a prerequisite for allowing the possibility that people could voluntarily get a higher price for their land. That's all I'm saying. Now, beyond that, if there's a loss, there is, and to say that there is no loser in that setup is absolutely incorrect, in fact, because a large number of people who benefit from the current system, as the kind of political economy situation that Raghu points out, would be definite losers if there was a creation of a genuine land market. All right, in pretty much every state, one of the jobs that a civil servant really wants is the person who's in charge of land title for precisely this reason, because you have access to land title, you have access to change of land use, you can make a large amount of money. I still don't understand why Huda put Khemka in that job, but it's the kind of job where people can make a lot of money. So there are losers. A powerful, connected people will lose on that, okay. And so it's not. Yeah. And the last question is what's the inequality? So I think I haven't talked about specific income inequality, but there are larger questions of what the inequality, the systemic inequality that is created through a system where you don't have sufficient entrepreneurship, where you don't allow people to maybe smaller companies to become bigger and so on and so forth. There are inequalities that are created through that. The larger question of why CEOs are paid too much and workers are paid too little, that's really not an India-specific question. It's something that it's something that we've seen throughout the world over the past and happening over the past 20 years. I don't think it comes purely from the deregulation of the 1980s, as some people claim. I think there's more to it than that. There is a technological push that means that people who have certain skills seem to get valued more by the market as it stands. Any solution to that kind of inequality will have to come in the shape of an acceptance of higher income taxation. I mean, there's really no answer to that. Whatever the market may pay you, the government should be able to take away more. You may return, I suspect, in the US in the next 5 or 7 years to a time of higher income taxation than they've seen for the past 25 or 30 years. So I think that, and then we will no doubt follow suit as and when. So if that's your answer.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you, Mihir, for being here, for taking questions. Thank you to everyone for taking part in this. It's very nice to see a full house to discuss a book. It's even nicer to see good, intelligent questions coming through and testing Mihir on his understanding of some of those issues. So with that, I'm happy to bring this session to a close. Thank you very much.